Okay, so I think people are in. So I'm going to start off, if that's okay. My name is Stephanie Keogh. I am working on the Urban Sense project, which is an umbrella project, let's say under the TrainAI umbrella, I should say. And we are based in the National Centre of Geocomputation, which is over in the Ethos building in Maynooth. So I'm here with a couple of my colleagues. And we wanted to talk to you today about this newly launched Urban Sense project, which was only launched there at the end of January. And Minister Eamon Ryan was at that launch that took place in the Mansion House in Dublin. And it is an innovative pilot project, and it is to monitor greenhouse gas emissions in urban areas. So as you can see from this first slide, there are a number of collaborators on this particular project. So Maynooth being one of the kind of leaders of the TrainAI project, and that's kind of spearheaded by our PIs, Professors Rowan Fealy and Tim McCarthy. We have project partners again in UCD, and I'll mention Gerald Mills here as well. We also have a number of, let's say, industrial collaborators in Edgylot, Cellnex, Delmec, and one of our co-funders, Microsoft. So it was a really great example of a collaboration where we brought together a number of key players, whether that was from the scientific side of things, the sensor technology side of things, the physical infrastructure side of things, and indeed some of the edge computing elements. So we'll kind of talk about that in a little while. I want to give you a little background and some of the rationale behind why we are measuring urban greenhouse gas emissions. So we'll just kind of start with perhaps a slide that people will be familiar with. I'll just move through my slides here. Bear with me. Are my slides moving on? I don't think so. Hang on here now. Just bear with me for 2 seconds as I'm trying to just move through my slides, but of course it won't work. Okay. So here is the graph of representing, let's say, global CO2 concentrations. These are recorded in remote locations around the globe. So this one from the Mauna Loa Observatory on the Hawaiian Islands. So we're measuring parts per million, CO2 mole fraction parts per million. We measure this. This is basically nearly like our baseline CO2. So that's how we're able to gauge year on year our greenhouse gas emissions increasing. And as you'll see, since measurements began in the 1950s, we can see there's just this steady upward trend in global CO2 emissions. Now, as I said, these are recorded typically in remote locations, and that's to basically give a more representative idea of the picture. So in a well-mixed rural remote atmosphere. We know that technically, we have to report CO2 emissions per sector. So these are generally reported on a sectoral basis through what we call inventory-based estimates. And so you'll see familiar sectors like agriculture, like energy, and energy typically broken down into industry and also building energy use, residential and commercial, and also the likes of transportation. So typically, CO2 emissions are reported on this sectoral basis. Now, what that does is it allows us to gauge year on year how emissions in different sectors are performing, whether they're increasing or decreasing. What it doesn't allow us to do is really investigate the geography of these CO2 emissions. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see here is a global representation of carbon emissions in metric tons. And indeed, this is a slide from 2010. But ultimately, what I'm trying to highlight in this slide is the effect, let's say, of global cities on CO2 emissions. Okay, so there is this kind of need to move away from this traditional sector-based approach to really looking at an evidence-based approach that looks at the geography of emissions. And the reason I say that is in order for us to address all of these global grand challenges of climate change, of biodiversity loss, of food security, often when we look at of the challenge in climate change in particular, it becomes very difficult to figure out how do we go about devising policies to tackle this. And when we look at cities, well, actually they represent, less than 5% of the global land surface, but they also represent between 60 to 80% of global emissions. So let's take a minute and actually focus on a relatively small land proportion here and really focus or try to focus our efforts on understanding what's happening at the city scale, because this becomes a really effective scale, the urban scale, in which to introduce different policies to help mitigate against global carbon emissions. So it kind of moves away this question of how do we deliver mitigation strategies to where can we deliver these effective mitigation strategies? And that's really where the Terrain AI project comes into play, and indeed this Urban Sense project. So just to give you a quick overview, Terrain AI is a 50-person research team. We have multiple PIs and co-PIs and researchers working across upwards of 5 higher education institutes in Ireland. We also work in with Teagasc as well. We're a strategic partnership project in that we're co-funded by Science Foundation Ireland and Microsoft. And we were initially a 2-year project. So just to give you a little breakdown on that, and coming back to, because I want you to keep this in your mind all the time throughout this kind of presentation, is really Terrain AI is all about the where. So we're really trying to look at different terrain types and what are their global greenhouse gas kind of emissions looking like. We need to be more scientifically transparent and robust in how we measure and monitor these emissions. And we also need to provide really useful tools, both for researchers working in this space, but also to be able to provide an evidence base to help the global policy community. So help bringing policymakers to the table and helping them understand the evidence base so that they can design these kind of geographically refined policies. So here at Terrain AI, as I said, we've a very large team, particularly from Maynooth, and really it's focusing in on the where. So you'll see here there's a selection of terrain types. So we've got grasslands, croplands, forested sites, wetland, peatlands, urban, coastal, and other. And really key to this is that we're measuring and monitoring across all of these different geographies. And so we're measuring whether that is using space-based platforms. So we'd have satellite data, whether it's using aerial, UAV or airborne aircraft to collect data. We also have a benchmark site of flux towers located strategically across these different terrain types. And we also take on board data streams from different weather stations, potentially for different IoT-based sensors as well in the field. And really it's all about feeding this data into a digital infrastructure, a state-of-the-art digital infrastructure, whereby we index the data, we catalog it, we keep records, data lineage, again, trying to build that evidence base and build trust in data. We're layering on various different tools, modeling, data services. We're working in with different machine learning techniques, and all the while it's about really improving our monitoring and measurement of global greenhouse gases across these terrain types. And if we focus on the Urban Sense project here, let's take out that slice, let's take out that urban sector. And really, there's a whole host of questions in any of these terrains as to where we measure and how we measure. But if we focus on the urban for this particular example, I mean, we really have to think about our experimental design. And what I mean by that is, where do we actually place these sensors? Because we have to think about what is the data going to represent from these sensors that we're putting out in the field, and really, how do we get a representative look at what Dublin City is like in terms of its CO2 and methane concentrations. So we need to get an idea of what maybe a city centre location looks like. We also need to understand, crucially, what suburban locations look like, because that's where the vast majority of people live in Dublin. We need to look at commuter corridors, so we need to look at the likes of our M50, our N4, all of these key commuter corridors that really rely on private car use, and what are the concentrations and emissions like from these particular locations. Another one that's really important to be able to incorporate into the Urban Sense project was the industrial estate, whether that's Bluebell, Airside. These are core and integral to city structures and cityscapes across the globe. So really what we're trying to do is make sure that when we're measuring in cities, that we're measuring a representative sample of all of these urban subtypes. And that's going to allow us to understand the role of human activity on emissions, but also sequestration, because cities in certain landscapes can actually act to sequester CO2 at certain times of the year, particularly where we have well vegetated, dense tree coverage. So just to give you an idea of some of the Urban Sense sensor locations, they're highlighted in green on this slide. So again, you'll see that we have a number of city centre locations, and you'll see the River Liffey dissecting the Greater Dublin Area. So we have city centre locations. We have locations within suburbs to the north and south of Dublin. We also have sensors located on the likes of the N4, just close to Palmerstown. We have them located close to the M50. And really what we're trying to figure out and what we're trying to learn is, are there daily patterns in our measurements that we can link back to human activity and human behaviours, whether that's driving, whether that's residential energy use, whether that's people movement. And so what we have to really do is look at our data sets in conjunction with other data sources that I'll bring you through in the next few slides. This is just to give you a quick idea of what these sensors and what these kind of measurement locations look like. And this is particularly where we were able to collaborate with industry partners to help us with both the physical infrastructure and the digital infrastructure required to deploy sensor networks such as Urban Sense. So we have these stations are kind of co-located on cell-next towers. And some of the benefits to that is that we actually have access to power and we have connectivity. And so in an urban sense, that's quite beneficial. What we'll find is in a lot of our remote locations, power supply and connectivity can be a real barrier and pose a lot of problems. So we are looking in the urban sense that we do have this connectivity and also a constant power supply. So some of the variables that we are measuring include those that you'd find on kind of a simple meteorological station. So things like a wind vane, where you'd get things like wind speed, wind direction. We have temperature, pressure, relative humidity, CO2 concentrations, methane concentrations, and interestingly, these actually pick up noise. So again, thinking about noise, it could be a proxy for human activity, it could be a proxy for traffic, for instance. Other kinds of data sources that we are pulling into the Urban Sense platform really relate to the land cover and the land use. So understanding the underlying surface and understanding how the underlying surface may have an effect on these exchanges of CO2 and methane. And again, thinking about this in an urban setting where you will have urban parks, you'll have trees, you'll have back gardens, and all of which can actually really contribute to the signal that's measured at these sensor locations. We bring in different land use information. We also look at air codes, so being able to understand the city in terms of commercial, retail, and residential land uses. We are pulling in traffic data. So there's a SCATS traffic counter information that's provided from Dublin City Council. And this gives us really, really granular information across hundreds of traffic counters across the city, giving us data on an hourly basis. So traffic counts at particular junctions that we'll look to pull in and analyse alongside our CO2 information. As I mentioned before, vegetation in an urban setting is actually very, very important. So we use local authority data sets, many of which are open data sets available on the likes of data.gov.ie, where local authorities collect point location information on the location of their trees. And so this will be, again, another important data set to layer in, because if we're seeing reduced carbon dioxide concentrations in summer or springtime months, that align with, let's say, the growing season, we might be able to look at, okay, well, is the tree density in that particular location quite high? Is it low? And that helps us, again, attribute the CO2 signal to some of these biogenic sources and human sources. We also want to be able to pull in data about people. So again, local authorities collect pedestrian footfall information. They also collect cycle counter information, public bike rental information, and also looking at occupancy data using digital phone network information. So again, understanding how people move through a city and how that might actually have an effect on the measurements that we are collecting. And again, think about this, if we were looking back to things in the last week, even in the news, how do we bring in different policies? So that might be the pedestrianisation of many parts of Dublin City. But really, if we can use our data as a baseline and look at the effects of these kind of policy changes and city use changes on these CO2 concentrations, becomes a very useful tool to see, okay, was that policy effective? How can we roll that out somewhere else? And what's the evidence base for it? Well, now we have a starting point and we have a data set to back up some of this. Other data sets that we hope to bring in include the CSO, so census data. Again, this gives us an idea of commuting patterns, how people typically get to work in a particular area, the uptake of electric vehicles, for example, the likelihood or proportion of people working from home in a particular small area, for example. We'll also look at modelled CO2 emissions data. So this was work commissioned by the Environmental Protection Agency, which is really possibly an underutilized data set just because of the sheer scale of it. But again, we're going to have a go at looking at how our observations tie up to some of the estimates for these locations around Dublin. Just to give you kind of a look at some of these data sets, and so you can understand what they look like. It's all well and good me listing them off, but what I'm going to do in the next few slides is give you an indication of kind of what that looks like in our kind of state-of-the-art digital infrastructure. What you see in front of you is this map area. So this is the CO2 emissions data. And you'll see very gradual changes occurring in and around cities. And indeed, you'll see this newly web network that kind of is co-located with the road network, where you'll see these kind of orange and red radial kind of lines coming out of different cities. So again, that's linking in the modelled transport related emissions to different kind of towns and cities nationwide. This gives you, again, as I said, estimates. And so what we're looking at really is being able to evaluate some of these estimates with some of the observations that we've been taking using our sensor data. Here is a look at the data within our Terrain AI platform. So this again is within the Urban Sense project, which I mentioned was kind of sits underneath the Terrain AI umbrella. And what you'll see is, and I'm just going to move around some of my things so I can see, you'll see that there's a legend up in the top right hand corner. You'll see map era. And as I scroll down through the next few data layers, you'll be able to see how it is that we kind of visualize and analyze the data that we're pulling in. This is a closer look at that CO2 estimates across Dublin. You see the Dublin Bay there. The heavier, kind of darker red indicating a lot of the city centre locations, but also the likes of Dublin Port and the likes of some of the industrial estates located around the periphery and indeed around the M50 location. I mentioned that we would be looking at the land cover. So we pull in the most up-to-date land cover map of Ireland. Again, this is a state-of-the-art data set. And we pull this in, and this helps us to understand the nature of the underlying surface. So whether it is grassland, whether it's an amenities space, you'll see the Phoenix Park in green there to the left of the city centre. You'll see water. And red representing buildings. So again, more impervious surfaces in towards the city centre. Here is some of the air code data that we've been looking at, and again, being able to kind of classify the city into more residentially used areas of the city versus more commercial and retail, industry, and then other. bringing you down, this is a look at some of the urban tree data sets that we have for the city. And again, if we think back, you'll see St. Stephen's Green there in the kind of lower right-hand corner. Very, densely vegetated area of the city with very native and old tree species within this. And again, we'll be looking at tree density alongside our CO2 concentrations to see, can we see the positive effects of trees in cities, and can we use this as a policy lever, if you like, to try and improve CO2 concentrations in other parts of the city. Here's a look at some of the occupancy flow data that we've pulled into the platform. And again, this is looking at people movement using, their mobile phones effectively. So again, we work in with different data providers and have data agreements in place, allowing us to look at this. And this is just going back to some of our site and sensor locations. And what I want to kind of bring you through is, well, what does that kind of data look like? You've seen the sensors on board the rooftops. What does the data look like coming in to the platform, and how do we visualize, let's say, a time series data set alongside a lot of the spatial data sets that we've shown you? So quickly, just to show you, this is a windrows of CO2 concentrations across the city. And what you'll see is there's different concentrations in different parts of the city. And again, what you'll see is in some of the city centre locations, there's reasonably lower concentrations. And again, these are located in areas like Trinity, where you have this pedestrianised College Green, and where you have a higher tree density along Trinity College. And also you have a lot more pedestrianised use. So you're taking the private cars out in comparison to some of its counterparts along the quays, where you see reasonably higher emissions. And again, I'll just draw your attention even to the likes of Palmerstown and up near DCU. A lot of these are main commuter corridors into the city centre, representing reasonably higher CO2 concentrations. Bring you through to the next one here. Now, this gives you a representation, kind of a very close look at a particular site that we have on the quays. What I want to do is take a little bit of time to explain this, because there's an awful lot of data represented here. And if we start with the green dot, this is the sensor location here. And people might be asking, well, what is this red ellipse and what does that represent? Well, the red ellipse is actually what we call the measurement footprint, if you like. So what's getting measured at that green dot is typically represented by the land surface within this red ellipse. And that basically helps to explain why for different wind directions you might get different readings. And so the red ellipse would mean that the actual wind is coming from the southwest, traveling up over the Liffey there and then over the sensor path itself. So it's not necessarily that the sensor is measuring within the direct vicinity of the sensor location. That in fact changes per wind direction, and that can be something that over the course of a season we might see what we call kind of a predominant wind direction. And so for Ireland, typically, and particularly for Dublin, it generally is that southwesterly direction. So it's really about building up a picture of, okay, our data for the vast majority of the time comes from this particular wind direction. Well, what is the underlying surface here? And it's about looking at the tree density, the traffic counts, the building use, how many residents are there in this particular location, and really figuring out what is the human activity giving rise to these measurements at this site. And if I just bring you through the next one, you'll see how we cycle through. So for every half hour, this ellipse is changing depending on the wind direction and indeed depending on the wind speed. You'll see, I'll bring you down through the left-hand side legend where you'll see urban trees, traffic flow, and you'll see this wind footprint. And below that, you're getting an idea of the wind direction, the mean wind speed, the CO2 emissions, so the parts per million, and the traffic count. So this will bring us through. This should be a time-lapse video. Just let me know if it's moving. It might take a little bit longer, but you'll see that red ellipse changing. And again, you'll see a step kind of change where the wind direction changes quite dramatically. And again, all the while, everything that's measured at that sensor is represented by that ellipse at any given interval. So let's say for a 30-minute average or a 1 hour average. So really important that we have all of these explanatory variables and explanatory data sets to help us understand why concentrations are changing over the course of a day, over the course of a season, and indeed across all of these different sites.